On May 15th, 1990, 10 children from Oakwood Elementary boarded a school bus for their final field trip and vanished without a trace. No crash, no wreckage, no ransom note. The bus was found abandoned at Riverside Nature Camp with their backpacks still inside. 4 people witnessed what happened that day. 4 people gave statements to police. 4 completely different stories about the last moments before 10 innocent children disappeared forever. But 34 years later, when construction workers demolish an old building, they make a discovery that changes everything about that spring morning in 1990. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. 4 witnesses saw the same field trip unfold. 4 different perspectives, 4 different accounts, but only one witness was telling the truth, and the others were hiding the most terrifying secret imaginable. My name is Mike Torres, and I need people to understand what really happened on May 15th, 1990, the day that changed my life forever and left me carrying a burden of guilt that has consumed every waking moment for the past 34 years. I was the bus driver that morning, the man responsible for safely transporting 10 innocent children to what should have been a fun educational field trip, but instead became the worst tragedy our community has ever witnessed. I want to be completely honest about my role in the events that led to the disappearance of those beautiful children, because for 3 decades I have been haunted by questions about whether I could have done something different, whether I missed warning signs, or whether my decisions somehow contributed to the terrible fate that befell them during what was supposed to be a routine school trip. I had been driving school buses for Oakwood County for 8 years when I was assigned to transport the 4th grade class from Oakwood Elementary to Riverside Nature Camp for their end-of-year field trip. It was supposed to be a celebration, a reward for the children who had worked hard all year, and I was genuinely excited to be part of an experience that would create positive memories for these kids as they prepared to advance to 5th grade. The morning started like any other school trip. I arrived at the transportation depot at 6:30 a.m. to perform my pre-trip safety inspection, checking the brakes, lights, emergency equipment, and ensuring that every seatbelt was functioning properly. I took pride in maintaining my bus to the highest safety standards because I understood that parents were trusting me with their most precious possessions, their children. By 7:45 a.m., I had positioned the bus in the circular drive at Oakwood Elementary, where excited 4th graders were already gathering with their teachers and parent volunteers. The energy was infectious as the children chattered about their upcoming adventure, comparing the contents of their lunch bags and speculating about the activities they would experience at the nature camp. The substitute teacher, Miss Sarah Jensen, approached me with a clipboard containing the official passenger manifest and emergency contact information. She seemed nervous, which I attributed to the normal anxiety that comes with being responsible for someone else's students during an off-campus activity. She carefully reviewed the safety procedures with me and emphasized the importance of following the exact route that had been approved by the school administration. As the children boarded the bus, I made sure each one was properly seated and secured with seatbelts. They were such beautiful, bright kids, full of excitement and anticipation for their special day. I remember thinking how fortunate I was to have a job that allowed me to be part of these positive experiences that would become cherished memories for both the children and their families. At exactly 8:15 a.m., we departed Oakwood Elementary with 10 children, 1 substitute teacher, and 1 parent volunteer who had agreed to assist with supervision during the field trip. The weather was perfect for an outdoor adventure, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that would make the nature activities enjoyable for everyone involved. The drive to Riverside Nature Camp typically took about 45 minutes along country roads that wound through beautiful Texas countryside. The children sang songs, played simple games, and maintained the kind of cheerful chatter that made school field trips such memorable experiences. I found myself smiling as I listened to their conversations about what animals they hoped to see and which activities they were most excited to try. However, about 20 minutes into our journey, I noticed a man standing beside the road at a fork that I had never seen before. He was well-dressed, wearing what appeared to be clerical clothing, and he was waving at our bus in a way that suggested he needed assistance or had an important message to communicate. I slowed the bus and rolled down my window as the man approached. He introduced himself as Father David Cross and explained that there had been a last-minute change to the field trip arrangements due to maintenance issues at the original nature camp location. He said that the children would be taken to an alternative site that offered even better educational opportunities and that all the proper notifications had been sent to parents and school officials. Father Cross showed me what appeared to be official documentation authorizing the route change, including letterhead from the school district and signatures that looked legitimate to my untrained eye. He explained that he was a volunteer coordinator with the educational program and that he would personally escort our group to ensure that everything went smoothly with the modified itinerary. The substitute teacher, Miss Sarah Jensen, seemed hesitant about the change and asked several questions about the new location and the educational activities that would be provided. Father Cross patiently answered her concerns and assured her that the alternative site had been carefully selected to meet all the learning objectives that had been established for the original field trip. Looking back now, I realized that I should have been more suspicious about this unexpected change in plans. As an experienced bus driver, I knew that route modifications were typically communicated well in advance and that last-minute changes were unusual for school-sponsored activities. However, Father Cross seemed knowledgeable about the educational goals of the trip and presented documentation that appeared authentic. The children were excited about the prospect of visiting a new location that they had never heard of before, and their enthusiasm helped convince me that this change might actually be an improvement over the original plans. Father Cross mentioned that the alternative site included wildlife viewing opportunities and hands-on activities that were not available at the standard nature camp, which sounded educational and engaging. After conferring briefly with Miss Jensen, we agreed to follow Father Cross to the alternative location. He provided detailed directions and offered to lead us in his own vehicle to ensure that we didn't get lost on unfamiliar roads. The children remained excited and well-behaved during this unexpected detour, trusting that the adults were making decisions in their best interests. The drive to the alternative site took us deeper into the countryside than I had expected, along increasingly narrow roads that eventually became little more than gravel paths through dense forest. Father Cross had explained that the remote location was part of what made this educational opportunity so special, as it would allow the children to experience nature in a more authentic setting than the typical commercial nature camp. When we finally arrived at our destination, I was surprised by how rustic and undeveloped the site appeared. There were several simple wooden buildings scattered among the trees, but nothing that resembled the modern facilities I had expected based on Father Cross's descriptions of the educational programs that were supposedly available at this location. Father Cross assured me that the primitive appearance of the site was intentional, designed to give children a more realistic understanding of how people lived in harmony with nature before modern conveniences became commonplace. He explained that the educational activities would focus on traditional skills and environmental awareness that couldn't be taught effectively in more developed settings. As the children disembarked from the bus, they seemed slightly less enthusiastic than they had been during the journey. The remote location was quieter and more isolated than they had anticipated, and some of them began asking questions about when they would return to school and whether their parents knew about the change in plans. Miss Jensen also appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, particularly when she noticed that there were no other educational groups or staff members visible at the site. She asked Father Cross about the promised activities and requested a schedule of events so that she could ensure the children would be ready for pickup at the designated time. Father Cross explained that the other staff members were preparing materials for the educational activities and that they would join us shortly. He suggested that I could leave the bus parked at the site and return at the scheduled pickup time, or I could wait in the nearby town if I preferred not to remain at the remote location for the entire duration of the field trip. Looking back now, I recognized that this was the moment when I should have insisted on staying with the children or demanded to speak with other supervisors who could verify the legitimacy of this alternative educational program. However, Father Cross was persuasive and professional in his manner, and I had no reason to suspect that anything sinister was being planned for these innocent children. I made the decision to return at the scheduled pickup time rather than waiting at the site for the entire day.
Father Cross assured me that the children would be well cared for and that the educational activities would proceed according to the timeline that had been established for the original field trip. He provided me with specific directions for returning to the site and confirmed the exact time when I should arrive for the pickup. As I prepared to leave, several of the children ran over to the bus to wave goodbye and to confirm that I would be back to take them home at the end of the day. I assured them that I would return exactly on schedule and that they should focus on enjoying their special educational adventure. Their smiling faces and excited voices are memories that have haunted me every day since that terrible morning. The drive back to town felt strange and unsettling, though I couldn't identify exactly why I felt uncomfortable about leaving the children at the remote site. Something about the situation didn't feel quite right, but I couldn't pinpoint any specific problems that would have justified my growing sense of unease about the last-minute changes to the field trip arrangements. I spent the day running errands and handling routine maintenance tasks, but I found myself frequently checking my watch and thinking about the children I had left at the educational site. I kept telling myself that my concerns were unfounded and that Father Cross had seemed genuinely committed to providing a positive learning experience for the kids. When the designated pickup time arrived, I drove back to the remote site, following the directions that Father Cross had provided. However, when I reached the location where I had dropped off the children earlier that morning, I found the area completely deserted. The buildings were empty, there were no vehicles present, and there was no sign of the children, Miss Jensen, the parent volunteer, or Father Cross. I searched the immediate area and called out for the children, thinking that perhaps they were engaged in activities in a different part of the site. However, my calls echoed unanswered through the empty forest, and it became increasingly clear that something terrible had happened during the hours I had been away. Panic began to set in as I realized that I had no way to contact anyone for assistance. This was 1990, before cell phones were widely available, and the remote location had no telephone service. I had no choice but to drive back to town as quickly as possible to report what I had discovered and to alert authorities that the children were missing. The drive back to civilization seemed to take forever as my mind raced with horrible possibilities about what might have happened to the children I was responsible for transporting safely. I kept hoping that there would be some simple explanation, that perhaps the group had moved to a different location for their activities, or that there had been some miscommunication about the pickup arrangements. When I finally reached a telephone, I immediately called the school district emergency number to report that the children were missing from the field trip site. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with school officials, parents, and law enforcement converging on both the school and the last known location where the children had been seen. The investigation that followed was the most difficult experience of my life. I was questioned extensively about every detail of the morning's events, from my interactions with Father Cross to my decision to leave the children at the remote site. I provided complete and honest answers to every question, but I could see the doubt and suspicion in the eyes of investigators who couldn't understand how I could have been so completely deceived by Father Cross unless I was somehow complicit in the plan to harm the children. These accusations were devastating because I knew in my heart that I had genuinely believed I was following legitimate instructions and acting in the children's best interests. However, I also understood that my decisions had placed them in danger, and I began to question whether I should have been more suspicious about the last-minute changes to the field trip arrangements. The guilt and self-doubt consumed my thoughts during the months that followed. I replayed every moment of that morning over and over in my mind, looking for signs I should have recognized or decisions I should have made differently. I wondered whether the children would still be safe if I had insisted on staying at the site, or if I had demanded more verification of Father Cross's authority to change the field trip plans. My relationship with my own family became strained as the stress of the investigation and the weight of my guilt affected my ability to function normally in my daily life. My wife tried to be supportive, but she couldn't understand why I continued to blame myself for events that seemed beyond my control, and our conversations about the situation often ended in arguments or painful silence. The school district placed me on administrative leave during the investigation, and it became clear that my career as a school bus driver was over, regardless of whether I was found to have acted negligently. Parents and community members no longer trusted me with their children's safety, and I couldn't blame them for their concerns given the terrible outcome of my last assignment. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement officials determined that Father David Cross was not affiliated with any legitimate educational organization and that the documentation he had shown me was fraudulent. This information validated my claim that I had been deceived, but it didn't alleviate my guilt about falling for a deception that had placed innocent children in danger. The search for Father Cross proved fruitless, as investigators could find no record of anyone matching his description in databases of educational personnel, religious organizations, or criminal records. It was as if he had appeared specifically to intercept their school bus and then vanished completely after accomplishing whatever sinister purpose had motivated his deception. Years passed without any trace of the missing children being found, and the case gradually faded from public attention as other tragedies and concerns occupied the community's focus. However, I never stopped thinking about those 10 beautiful children and wondering what had happened to them after I left them at that remote site on May 15, 1990. I moved away from Oakwood County in 1993, unable to continue living in a community where I was constantly reminded of my failure to protect the children who had been placed in my care. I found work in construction and other manual labor jobs that didn't require the kind of trust and responsibility that I felt I no longer deserved to be given by others. The nightmares began shortly after the children disappeared and continued for years afterwards. I would dream about their faces, hear their voices calling for help, and wake up in cold sweats, feeling as though I had abandoned them all over again. Sleep became difficult, and I began relying on alcohol to help me escape from the constant replaying of that terrible morning in my mind. My marriage ended in 1995, as my wife finally reached the point where she could no longer cope with my depression, guilt, and drinking. She tried to help me move forward, but I was unable to forgive myself for my role in the children's disappearance, and my inability to heal was destroying our relationship and affecting our own children's well-being. I drifted from job to job and town to town during the following years, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships or build a stable life. The guilt followed me everywhere I went, and I found myself avoiding situations where I might be responsible for other people's safety or well-being. In 2010, 20 years after the children disappeared, I received an unexpected phone call from a private investigator who was reviewing cold cases and wanted to interview me about my memories of that morning. I agreed to meet with her, hoping that some new information had been discovered that might finally provide answers about what had happened to those innocent children. The investigator had uncovered some additional information about cult activity in rural Texas during the early 1990s, including reports of children being recruited or abducted for use in religious ceremonies or community labor. She believed that Father Cross might have been connected to one of these groups and that the missing children might have been taken to an isolated compound where they could be indoctrinated and controlled.
This information provided some context for understanding what might have motivated Father Cross's deception, but it didn't offer any concrete leads about where the children might be located or whether any of them might still be alive. The investigator assured me that she would continue pursuing any leads that developed, but she cautioned that the trail had grown very cold after so many years. The conversation with the investigator reopened emotional wounds that had never fully healed and reminded me of all the questions that remained unanswered about that terrible day. I found myself once again obsessing over every detail of my interactions with Father Cross and wondering whether I had missed some crucial opportunity to prevent the tragedy that had unfolded. During the years that followed, I occasionally received updates from law enforcement officials who continued to investigate the case whenever new information or potential leads emerged. However, none of these developments resulted in any breakthrough that brought us closer to finding the missing children or understanding their fate. I never remarried or had additional children of my own, feeling that I didn't deserve the happiness and fulfillment that comes with family life after my failure to protect the children who had been entrusted to my care. The guilt had become such a fundamental part of my identity that I couldn't imagine who I would be without it,
even though I recognized that it was preventing me from building a meaningful life. In recent years, I have tried to find some peace through community service and volunteer work with organizations that focus on child safety and missing persons cases. I hope that by contributing to efforts to protect other children, I might be able to create some positive meaning from the tragedy that had defined so much of my adult life. However, the work often triggered painful memories and reminded me of my own failure to keep those 10 children safe on what should have been a fun and educational day trip. I would see the faces of missing children on flyers and websites and remember the excited voices of the kids who had boarded my bus that morning 34 years ago. The discovery of evidence related to the missing children in 2024 has brought both relief and renewed anguish as I finally learn what happened to those innocent kids after I left them at that remote site. While I am grateful that the truth has finally emerged, I am also devastated to learn about the suffering they endured and heartbroken that my decisions played a role in placing them in such terrible danger. I want the families of those children to know that not a single day has passed in the last 34 years without my thinking about their sons and daughters and wishing that I had made different choices that morning. I understand that my remorse cannot undo the harm that was caused by my failure to recognize the deception that placed their children in danger, but I hope they can find some measure of peace in knowing that the truth has finally been revealed. Mike Torres had carried the weight of guilt and responsibility for 34 years, never knowing that his trust in Father David Cross had delivered 10 innocent children into the hands of a dangerous cult leader who had used his religious authority and persuasive manner to orchestrate their disappearance from a routine school field trip. My name is Sarah Jensen, and I need people to understand why I remained silent for 34 years about what I witnessed on May 15, 1990, the day 10 innocent children disappeared during what should have been a routine field trip. I was the substitute teacher responsible for their supervision that morning, and my failure to speak up when something felt wrong has haunted every moment of my life since that terrible day. I want to be completely honest about my cowardice, my poor judgment, and my devastating failure to protect the children who had been placed in my care, because those beautiful kids deserved so much better than what they received from me during the most critical moments when I could have made different choices that might have saved their lives. I had only been substitute teaching for 6 months when I was called to cover for Mrs. Patterson's 4th grade class at Oakwood Elementary. She had become ill with food poisoning the night before their planned field trip to Riverside Nature Camp, and the school desperately needed someone who could step in at the last minute to supervise the children during their educational adventure. I was nervous about taking on such a significant responsibility, as I had never supervised a field trip before and felt uncertain about handling 10 energetic 4th graders in an unfamiliar outdoor setting. However, the school administration assured me that the trip was well organized with clear safety protocols and educational activities that had been successfully conducted many times in previous years. Mrs. Patterson had left detailed notes about each child, including information about their personalities, any special needs or concerns, and emergency contact information for their parents. I spent the evening before the trip reviewing these materials and trying to memorize the names and faces of the children I would be responsible for supervising the next day. The morning of May 15th started early, as I needed to arrive at school by 7:30 a.m. to meet with the bus driver, review safety procedures, and prepare the children for their departure. I was excited but anxious about the day ahead, hoping that everything would go smoothly and that the children would have a positive educational experience, despite having an unfamiliar teacher supervising their special trip. When I arrived at Oakwood Elementary, the children were already gathering in the main hallway, their excitement palpable as they chattered about their upcoming adventure and compared the contents of their lunch bags. They were such beautiful, bright kids, full of energy and anticipation for what they expected to be a memorable day of outdoor learning and fun activities. I introduced myself to each child individually, trying to establish a rapport and help them feel comfortable with having a substitute teacher supervising their field trip. They were polite and welcoming, though I could sense some disappointment that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't be able to join them for their special day. The bus driver, Mike Torres, seemed professional and experienced, and he carefully reviewed the safety procedures with me before we began loading the children. He emphasized the importance of ensuring that every child remained properly seated and secured with seatbelts throughout the journey, and he provided me with emergency contact information in case any problems developed during the trip. As we departed Oakwood Elementary, right on schedule, I felt cautiously optimistic that the day would proceed smoothly. The children were well-behaved and excited, singing songs and engaging in cheerful conversation as we traveled along the country roads toward Riverside Nature Camp. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to experiencing their joy as they participated in the planned outdoor activities. However, about 20 minutes into our journey, something happened that immediately made me feel uncomfortable and uncertain about how to respond. The bus driver suddenly slowed down and pulled over to speak with a man who was standing beside the road at a fork I had never seen before during previous trips to the nature camp. The man introduced himself as Father David Cross and claimed that there had been a last-minute change to our field trip destination due to maintenance problems at Riverside Nature Camp. He said that the children would be taken to an alternative site that would provide even better educational opportunities, and he showed us documentation that appeared to authorize this change in plans. Something about Father Cross made me immediately uncomfortable, though I struggled to identify exactly what was bothering me about his appearance or his manner. He was well-dressed and spoke with apparent authority about educational matters, but there was something in his eyes or in his tone of voice that triggered alarm bells in my mind. I asked several questions about the alternative location, the educational activities that would be provided, and whether parents had been notified about the change in plans. Father Cross patiently answered my concerns and assured me that all proper notifications had been sent and that the alternative site had been carefully selected to meet the learning objectives established for the original field trip. The children seemed excited about the prospect of visiting a new location, and their enthusiasm made it difficult for me to voice the doubts that were growing stronger with each passing moment. I found myself caught between my instinctive distrust of Father Cross and my uncertainty about whether I had the authority to refuse a change in plans that appeared to have been authorized by school officials. Looking back now, I realized that this was the moment when I should have insisted on returning to school to verify the legitimacy of the proposed changes before proceeding to any alternative location. However, I was intimidated by Father Cross's apparent authority and worried that questioning his instructions might create problems for me as a substitute teacher who was still trying to establish credibility within the school system. My hesitation and indecision during those critical moments allowed Father Cross to convince the bus driver to follow him to the alternative site, despite my growing sense that something was seriously wrong with this unexpected change in our carefully planned itinerary. I felt like I was being swept along by events beyond my control, unable to assert the kind of decisive leadership that the situation demanded. The route to the alternative site took us deeper into unfamiliar countryside than I had expected, along increasingly narrow roads that eventually became little more than gravel paths through dense forest. Father Cross had explained that the remote location would provide a more authentic nature experience, but the isolation made me increasingly anxious about our safety and the appropriateness of this destination for a school-sponsored activity.
When we finally arrived at the site, I was shocked by how primitive and undeveloped it appeared compared to the modern facilities I had expected based on Father Cross's descriptions. The buildings were simple wooden structures scattered among trees, with no visible signs indicating that this was a legitimate educational facility. I immediately approached Father Cross with my concerns about the rustic conditions and the apparent lack of other staff members or educational groups at the site. He assured me that the primitive appearance was intentional and that other staff members were preparing materials for the activities that would begin shortly after our arrival. The children seemed less enthusiastic than they had been during the bus ride, and several of them began asking questions about when they would return to school and whether their parents knew about the change in location. Their concerns mirrored my own doubts about the legitimacy of this alternative educational program. I felt increasingly trapped by the situation, wanting to insist that we return to the original destination, but uncertain about my authority to override what appeared to be official instructions from educational supervisors. Father Cross was persuasive and seemed knowledgeable about educational matters, but my instincts continued to scream that something was terribly wrong with this entire scenario. When Father Cross suggested that the bus driver could leave and return at the scheduled pickup time, I experienced a moment of panic at the thought of being left alone with the children at this remote and unfamiliar location. I wanted to insist that the bus driver remain with us, but I was too intimidated to challenge Father Cross's apparent authority. As the bus driver prepared to leave, I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of supervising 10 children in an environment that felt increasingly threatening and inappropriate. Several of the children seemed nervous about being left at the isolated site, and their anxiety reinforced my own growing sense that we were in danger. However, I was too paralyzed by doubt and fear to take decisive action that might have protected the children from whatever Father Cross was planning to do to them. I told myself that I was probably overreacting to normal anxiety about supervising a field trip in an unfamiliar location, and I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine once the promised educational activities began. After the bus driver left, Father Cross led us toward one of the wooden buildings, explaining that we would begin with an orientation session about the natural environment and the traditional skills that would be demonstrated during our visit. The children followed reluctantly, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by uncertainty and growing apprehension. Inside the building, Father Cross began what seemed like a normal educational presentation about wildlife and environmental conservation. However, his manner gradually became more intense and controlling, and he began making statements about the corrupting influence of modern society and the need for children to be protected from harmful outside influences. I realized that we were not participating in a legitimate educational program, but were instead being exposed to some form of religious or ideological indoctrination that had nothing to do with the nature study activities that had been promised. Father Cross's presentation became increasingly disturbing as he talked about the need to separate children from families who might not understand their spiritual development. At this point, I knew with absolute certainty that we were in serious danger and that I needed to find a way to get the children away from this place immediately. However, Father Cross had positioned himself between us and the door, and I realized that we were essentially trapped in this isolated location with no means of communication or escape. I tried to remain calm and avoid triggering Father Cross's anger while I looked for opportunities to protect the children or signal for help. Several of the kids were clearly frightened by his increasingly erratic behavior, and I knew that I needed to find a way to reassure them while also developing some kind of plan to ensure our safety. When I suggested that it was time for lunch and that the children might be more comfortable eating outside in the fresh air, Father Cross became visibly agitated and insisted that we needed to complete the orientation session before any other activities could begin. His controlling behavior confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. I tried to engage Father Cross in conversation about his background and qualifications, hoping to buy time while I assessed our situation and looked for possible escape routes. However, he became increasingly evasive about his credentials and more insistent that I stop interrupting his presentation with unnecessary questions. The children were becoming more frightened and restless as Father Cross's behavior became more erratic and controlling. Several of them began crying and asking when they could go home, which seemed to anger him further and make him more determined to assert his authority over our group. I realized that Father Cross was not going to allow us to leave voluntarily, and that he had some kind of plan for the children that involved keeping them at this isolated location indefinitely. I felt responsible for getting them into this dangerous situation and desperate to find some way to protect them from whatever he was planning to do to them. However, I was too frightened and overwhelmed to take effective action that might have saved the children from the terrible fate that Father Cross had planned for them. I kept hoping that someone would realize we were missing and send help, but I knew that we had followed him to this remote location voluntarily, and no one would know where to look for us. As the day progressed, it became clear that Father Cross had no intention of allowing us to return to school or to contact our families. He began talking about the need for the children to remain at the site for an extended period of spiritual preparation and education that would help them develop into better people than they could become in the corrupt outside world. The children were terrified and crying, begging to go home to their parents, but Father Cross insisted that their families didn't understand what was best for them and that he was going to provide them with the guidance and protection they needed to develop properly. I knew then that he was planning to keep the children permanently and that I might be the only person who could prevent this tragedy. I made several desperate attempts to find opportunities to escape with the children or to signal for help, but Father Cross watched us constantly and had positioned other adults around the site who prevented any attempts to leave. I realized that we were prisoners and that our situation was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. As evening approached, Father Cross separated me from the children, claiming that I needed to be questioned about my background and my commitment to their spiritual development. I was taken to a different building where I was interrogated about my beliefs, my family, and my potential willingness to participate in their community. During this interrogation, I learned that Father Cross was the leader of a religious cult that recruited children for indoctrination and labor within their isolated community. He explained that the children would be given new names and new identities and would be taught to forget their previous lives and families, which he characterized as harmful influences that had been corrupting their spiritual development. I was horrified to realize the full scope of what Father Cross was planning to do to the innocent children I was supposed to be protecting, and I begged him to let them return to their families. However, he made it clear that the children would never be allowed to leave, and that I would face serious consequences if I continued to resist his authority or tried to interfere with his plans. When I threatened to report everything to authorities if I was released, Father Cross laughed and explained that no one would believe my story and that the children would simply disappear without a trace if I caused any trouble. He made it clear that my survival depended on my willingness to cooperate with his plans and to help convince the children to accept their new life within the cult community. However, something about his demeanor and the way he was interacting with the children made me immediately uncomfortable and suspicious about his intentions. I watched as Father Cross spoke to the children in what appeared to be an intense, controlling manner, gesturing emphatically and occasionally pointing toward the old logging buildings, as if he was explaining something important about their visit to this location. The children listened with obvious reluctance and fear, staying huddled together and frequently looking toward the teacher as if seeking reassurance or protection. The teacher appeared nervous and uncomfortable with the situation, frequently interrupting Father Cross's presentation to ask questions or make comments that seemed designed to redirect his attention away from the children. Her body language suggested that she was as confused and concerned about the circumstances as the children were, and I could see that she was struggling to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. My training and experience as a law enforcement officer, which I had been before becoming a park ranger, told me that something was seriously wrong with this scenario. School field trips to forest preserves followed established protocols and safety procedures, and they certainly didn't involve taking children to remote, abandoned locations that were off-limits to public access and far from approved educational facilities. I knew that I should approach the group immediately to verify their authorization to be in this restricted area and to ensure that the children were safe and properly supervised. However, I hesitated because I wasn't entirely certain about my jurisdiction in this situation, and I was concerned about potentially interfering with what might be a legitimate educational activity that had simply been relocated due to circumstances I wasn't aware of. This hesitation and uncertainty would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes of my entire life, as the few minutes I spent trying to decide how to respond gave Father Cross and his accomplices the time they needed to implement whatever plan they had developed for taking control of these innocent children. As I continued to observe from my concealed position, I saw Father Cross signal to the other men, who began herding the children toward the old logging buildings in a manner that appeared increasingly coercive and threatening. The children resisted this direction, clearly wanting to return to their bus and go back to school, but they were overwhelmed by the adults who were insisting that they comply with instructions. The teacher became more agitated as she realized that the situation was becoming dangerous for the children in her care, and I could hear her voice rising as she demanded explanations about what was happening and insisted that the children needed to be returned to school immediately. However, Father Cross and his accomplices ignored her protests and continued moving the children toward the buildings. At this point, I knew with absolute certainty that I was witnessing a crime in progress and that these children were in immediate danger from individuals who had clearly used deception to gain access to them for sinister purposes. I reached for my radio to call for backup and began moving toward the group to intervene, but I was too late to prevent what happened next. Father Cross had positioned his accomplices strategically around the clearing, and they were armed with weapons that they revealed as soon as they sensed any resistance from the teacher of the children. The sight of guns transformed the situation from a confusing encounter into a clear kidnapping in progress, and I realized that any attempt to approach the group openly would likely result in violence that could harm or kill the innocent children I was trying to protect. I found myself in an impossible position, wanting desperately to rescue the children, but recognizing that a direct confrontation would almost certainly lead to bloodshed and might result in the deaths of the very people I was trying to save. I had no backup available in this remote location, no way to communicate effectively with other law enforcement agencies, and no tactical advantage that would allow me to overcome multiple armed individuals who were clearly prepared for resistance. Instead of charging forward with what would have been a suicidal rescue attempt, I made the agonizing decision to remain hidden and observe what was happening so that I could provide detailed information to investigators when backup arrived. I called for emergency assistance on my radio, providing our location and a description of the kidnapping in progress, but I knew that help was at least 30 minutes away in this remote area. During those terrible minutes that followed, I watched helplessly as Father Cross and his accomplices forced the terrified children into the old logging buildings, separating them from their teacher and beginning what appeared to be some kind of indoctrination process designed to break down their resistance and establish psychological control over them. The teacher was taken to a different building where I could hear her voice raised in protest and pleading as she apparently tried to negotiate for the children's release. However, her arguments were clearly having no effect on Father Cross, who seemed committed to a plan that involved keeping the children permanently rather than releasing them after achieving some immediate criminal objective. As I continued to monitor the situation and wait for backup to arrive, I observed Father Cross's accomplices making preparations that suggested they intended to transport the children to a different location before law enforcement could respond to my emergency call. They began loading supplies into several vehicles that had been concealed in the forest, and they established a perimeter around the buildings that would allow them to detect and respond to any approaching rescue attempts. I realized that waiting for backup might mean losing the opportunity to track where the children were being taken, so I made the decision to follow the convoy when it departed while maintaining radio contact with the responding officers. However, Father Cross proved to be more prepared and organized than I had anticipated, and his group implemented counter-surveillance measures that made it impossible for me to follow them without being detected. The convoy split into multiple vehicles traveling in different directions, and they used techniques that suggested military or law enforcement training in evading pursuit. I was forced to choose which vehicle to follow, knowing that my decision might determine whether the children could be located and rescued or whether they would disappear forever into whatever network Father Cross had established for this purpose. I chose to follow the vehicle that appeared to contain the largest number of children, but I lost the trail within 20 minutes as the driver used back roads and forest paths that I wasn't familiar with. By the time backup arrived at the original location, the site had been completely cleared of evidence, and there was no trace of the school bus, the children, or their captors. The official investigation that followed was the most difficult and frustrating experience of my professional life. I provided detailed statements about everything I had witnessed, including descriptions of Father Cross and his accomplices, the vehicles they used, and the direction of travel when they departed the logging site with their captives. However, my account raised uncomfortable questions about why I had not attempted to rescue the children immediately when I first realized they were in danger. Investigators struggled to understand why a trained law enforcement officer would choose to observe rather than act when children were being kidnapped in front of him. And I found it difficult to explain my tactical reasoning in a way that didn't sound like cowardice or indifference. The truth was that I believed my decision to remain hidden and call for backup was the most responsible course of action given the circumstances. But I was tormented by doubt about whether a more aggressive approach might have saved the children, even if it had resulted in my own death. The second-guessing and self-recrimination began immediately and continued for the next 34 years. My description of Father Cross and his organization suggested that this was not a spontaneous crime, but rather a carefully planned kidnapping carried out by individuals with significant resources and experience in this type of criminal activity. However, despite extensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies, no trace of Father Cross or his organization was ever found, and the children remained missing without any additional leads or evidence. The failure of the search and rescue operation to locate the missing children affected me profoundly, as I began to question every decision I had made during those critical minutes when I could have potentially altered the outcome. I replayed the scenario endlessly in my mind, considering different approaches that might have resulted in a successful rescue, and wondering whether my caution had actually contributed to the children's disappearance. My relationship with my colleagues in law enforcement became strained as word spread about my role in the failed rescue attempt.
While most people understood the difficult position I had been placed in, others questioned whether I had acted appropriately when faced with a situation that demanded immediate action to protect innocent lives.
The psychological impact of witnessing the kidnapping and failing to prevent it led to symptoms that I later recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. I experienced nightmares, anxiety attacks, and intrusive memories that made it difficult to function effectively in my role as a park ranger. I began avoiding the remote areas of the forest where the kidnapping had occurred, and I found myself constantly scanning for signs of suspicious activity that might indicate the presence of other predators. I sought counseling through the Employee Assistance Program, but I struggled to discuss the details of what I'd witnessed without reliving the trauma and guilt associated with my failure to save the children. The counselor tried to help me understand that I had made reasonable decisions based on the information available to me at the time, but I couldn't forgive myself for not taking more aggressive action. My performance as a park ranger deteriorated as I became increasingly preoccupied with the missing children and my role in their disappearance. I requested transfers to different areas, hoping that a change of scenery would help me escape the memories, but the guilt and regret followed me wherever I went within the Park Service system. I eventually took early retirement in 1998, unable to continue working in an environment that constantly reminded me of my failure to protect those innocent children when they needed help most. I moved to a different state and tried to build a new life away from the constant reminders of that terrible day, but the memories and guilt remained as powerful as ever. During the years that followed, I followed every development in the case through news reports and contacts within law enforcement. I hoped that some breakthrough would finally lead to the rescue of the children or at least provide answers about what happened to them after they were taken from that remote logging site. I occasionally contacted investigators to see if there were new leads or if my testimony might be helpful in pursuing different investigative approaches. However, the trail had grown completely cold, and there was no new evidence that could provide direction for continued search efforts. The discovery of evidence related to the missing children in 2024 has finally provided some answers about their fate, but it has also confirmed my worst fears about what they endured after I failed to rescue them from Father Cross and his accomplices. Learning the truth about their suffering has renewed my guilt and regret about not taking more decisive action when I had the opportunity to intervene. I want the families of those children to know that not a single day has passed in 34 years without my thinking about their sons and daughters and wishing that I had been braver or more decisive during those critical minutes when their lives hung in the balance. While I understand that my regret cannot change what happened, I hope that finally sharing the complete truth about what I witnessed might help provide some closure for families who have waited so long for answers. I also want other law enforcement officers and first responders to learn from my experience and to trust their instincts when they encounter situations that seem dangerous or wrong. The hesitation and second-guessing that prevented me from taking immediate action may have cost 10 innocent children their lives, and that is a burden I will carry until my dying day. Tom Bradley had witnessed the moment when 10 innocent children were taken by Father David Cross and his cult accomplices, and his decision to call for backup rather than attempt an immediate rescue had haunted him for 34 years as he wondered whether a more aggressive approach might have saved the lives of the children he had been sworn to protect. In March 2024, construction workers demolishing an abandoned warehouse in East Dallas made the discovery that would finally solve the 34-year mystery of the 10 missing children from Oakwood Elementary. Hidden beneath the concrete floor of the building's basement, they uncovered a sealed metal container containing personal belongings, photographs, and documents that would expose the truth about what happened on that terrible morning in May 1990. The forensic investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive, utilizing advanced DNA analysis and digital restoration techniques that had not been available during the original investigation. Within weeks, investigators confirmed that the evidence belonged to the missing children and began piecing together a horrifying picture of their fate at the hands of Father David Cross and his cult accomplices. Detective Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in cold cases involving missing children, immediately recognized the significance of the discovery and launched a comprehensive reinvestigation of the Oakwood Elementary case. The evidence recovered from the warehouse provided crucial leads that had been missing for over 30 decades, including the real identity of Father David Cross and the location of the compound where the children had been held. The investigation revealed that Father David Cross was actually David Marcus Crawley, a former seminary student who had been expelled from religious training for psychological instability and inappropriate behavior toward children. After his expulsion, Crawley had assumed the false identity of an ordained minister and had spent years developing a network of followers who believed in his twisted interpretation of religious doctrine that justified the abduction and indoctrination of children. Crawley had established a remote compound in the dense forests of East Texas, far from any populated areas or regular law enforcement patrols. The compound operated as a self-sufficient community where children who had been kidnapped from various locations were held, indoctrinated, and forced to work under conditions that amounted to slavery and systematic abuse. The forensic evidence recovered from the warehouse included detailed records that Crawley had kept of his criminal activities, apparently as a form of twisted documentation of what he believed to be his religious mission to save children from the corrupting influence of modern society. These records provided investigators with a complete picture of how the Oakwood Elementary kidnapping had been planned and executed, as well as information about other missing children cases that had previously been unsolved. According to Crawley's own documentation, the 10 children from Oakwood Elementary had been specifically targeted because of their age and the isolated location of their planned field trip that provided an opportunity to intercept them without witnesses or immediate law enforcement response. He had conducted surveillance of the school for weeks before the kidnapping, learning about the field trip schedule and identifying the route that the school bus would take to Riverside Nature Camp.
The plan had involved positioning himself at the remote fork in the road where he knew the bus would pass, presenting himself as a religious authority figure who could convincingly redirect the trip to an alternative location. His accomplices had prepared the abandoned logging site as a temporary staging area where the children could be transferred to other vehicles and transported to the compound without leaving traces that could be followed by law enforcement. The records revealed that bus driver Mike Torres had been completely innocent of any involvement in the kidnapping plot, having been genuinely deceived by Crowley's professional appearance and fraudulent documentation. Torres's trust in apparent authority figures and his lack of suspicion about last-minute changes had made him an unwitting accomplice to the crime, but he had no knowledge of Crowley's real intentions or criminal background. Similarly, Sarah Jensen had recognized that something was wrong about the situation, but had been too intimidated by Crowley's authoritative manner and apparent religious credentials to trust her instincts and take decisive action to protect the children. Her silence during the subsequent investigation had been motivated by fear of retaliation from Crowley's organization, rather than any actual involvement in the kidnapping plot. Park Ranger Tom Bradley's account of witnessing the kidnapping had been accurate, and his decision to call for backup rather than attempt an immediate rescue had been tactically sound, given the dangerous circumstances and the presence of armed accomplices. However, Crowley's organization had been better prepared for law enforcement response than Bradley had anticipated, and their escape plan had been designed to evade exactly the type of pursuit that Bradley had attempted. The investigation also revealed why the original search efforts had been unsuccessful in locating the children or their captors. Crowley's compound had been carefully camouflaged and was accessible only through unmarked forest roads that were not shown on any official maps. The buildings had been constructed to blend into the natural environment, and the organization had maintained strict security protocols that prevented any unauthorized access or observation. Most shocking of all, the investigation uncovered evidence that the compound had continued to operate for years after the Oakwood Elementary kidnapping, with Crowley's organization systematically abducting additional children from various locations throughout Texas and surrounding states. The total number of victims was estimated to be over 40 children who had been taken over a period of nearly 2 decades. The compound had finally been abandoned in 2008, when law enforcement pressure from unrelated investigations had made it too dangerous for the organization to maintain their operations in Texas. However, rather than releasing their captives, Crowley's followers had scattered to different locations, taking groups of children with them to establish smaller satellite compounds in other states. In April 2024, based on information recovered from the warehouse, federal investigators launched coordinated raids on 3 suspected compound locations in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. These operations, conducted by specialized FBI teams with expertise in cult deprogramming and child rescue, resulted in the discovery of 17 survivors, including 2 of the original 10 children from Oakwood Elementary. The survivors, now adults in their 40s, had been held in captivity for over 30 decades and required extensive medical and psychological care to help them readjust to life outside the cult environment. Many of them had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they initially resisted rescue efforts and had to be convinced that they were being taken to safety rather than being kidnapped by hostile outsiders. Rebecca Torres, who had been known as Rebecca during her captivity at the compound, was one of the 2 Oakwood Elementary survivors who was found alive during the federal raids. She had been 8 years old when she was kidnapped during the field trip, and she had spent 34 years believing that the outside world had forgotten about her and that her family had moved on with their lives without her. The other survivor, Michael Chen, had been 9 years old at the time of the kidnapping and had endured similar psychological manipulation and abuse during his decades in captivity. Both survivors required extensive therapy and support to help them understand what had happened to them and to begin the process of reconnecting with families who had never stopped searching for them. The reunion between Rebecca Torres and her parents was emotional and difficult, as both she and her family struggled to bridge the gap created by 34 years of separation and trauma. Rebecca had been taught that her family had abandoned her and that the cult community was the only place where she would be accepted and cared for, beliefs that required careful professional intervention to overcome. Michael Chen's reunion with his surviving family members was complicated by the fact that his parents had died during the years he was missing, leaving him with siblings and extended family members who were now strangers to him. The process of helping him understand what had happened to his family while he was in captivity was particularly challenging and required specialized psychological support. The investigation also provided closure for the families of the 8 children who did not survive their captivity at the compound. The recovered records indicated that these children had died from various causes over the years, including medical neglect, accidents, and the physical abuse that was routine within Crowley's organization. Their remains were eventually located and returned to their families for proper burial after decades of uncertainty about their fate. David Crowley herself was found living under another assumed identity in rural Montana, where he had been operating a small religious community that investigators suspected of being another front for child exploitation activities. At age 72, Crowley was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, child abuse, and murder related to his crimes spanning over 4 decades. The legal proceedings that followed provided additional details about the scope and operation of Crowley's criminal organization, revealing a network of accomplices and supporters who had enabled his crimes by providing financial support, hiding evidence, and helping to transport and conceal kidnapped children. Many of these individuals were also arrested and charged with various crimes related to their involvement in the organization. Bus driver Mike Torres, now 68 years old, was present in the courtroom when Crowley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The vindication of learning that he had been an innocent victim of Crowley's deception provided some measure of peace, but Torres continued to struggle with guilt about his role in enabling the kidnapping, even though he had been completely unaware of Crowley's criminal intentions. Sarah Jensen, who had left teaching shortly after the kidnapping and had spent 34 years working in administrative roles to avoid situations involving child supervision, also attended the sentencing hearing. Learning that her instincts about Crowley had been correct, and that her silence had been motivated by genuine fear rather than indifference, helped her begin to forgive herself for not speaking up when she sensed danger.
Tom Bradley, now retired and living in Colorado, traveled to Texas for the trial and finally had the opportunity to meet the families of the children he had tried to save. While he continued to wonder whether different decisions on his part might have resulted in a better outcome, the families expressed gratitude for his attempts to help and assured him that no one blamed him for the limitations of what any individual could have accomplished against such a well-organized criminal enterprise. The discovery of the truth about the Oakwood Elementary case prompted a comprehensive review of missing children cases from the 1980s and 1990s, as investigators sought to determine whether other disappearances might be connected to Crowley's organization or similar criminal networks. This review resulted in the reopening of several cold cases and provided new leads that helped solve additional crimes involving missing children. The case also led to changes in school safety protocols and field trip procedures, with new requirements for background checks on anyone who comes into contact with student groups during off-campus activities. The tragic outcome of trusting Crowley's fraudulent credentials highlighted the need for better verification systems and more robust security measures to protect children during educational outings. Rebecca Torres and Michael Chen, with the help of specialized therapists and support groups, began the long process of building new lives outside the cult environment, where they had been held for most of their adult lives. Both survivors expressed a desire to use their experiences to help other victims of similar crimes and to raise awareness about the ongoing threat posed by individuals and organizations that exploit children. The Oakwood Elementary Memorial, which had been established shortly after the children's disappearance in 1990, was updated to reflect the discovery of the truth about their fate.
The memorial now serves not only as a tribute to the victims, but also as a reminder of the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would harm children and of never giving up the search for missing loved ones. The resolution of the case provided a sense of closure for the Oakwood community, which had been haunted by the mystery of the missing children for over 3 decades. While the truth about their fate was more horrifying than many people had imagined, finally knowing what happened allowed the community to properly grieve for the victims and to celebrate the survival of those who had been rescued. The investigation also revealed the importance of trusting instincts when something seems wrong, as both Sarah Jensen and Tom Bradley had sensed danger but had been prevented by various factors from acting on their concerns. Their experiences serve as reminders that protecting children requires courage and decisive action, even when the full scope of a threat is not immediately apparent. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that justice can eventually be served even when crimes remain unsolved for decades, and that advances in investigative technology and techniques can provide new opportunities to solve cases that once seemed hopeless. The dedication of investigators who refused to give up on finding the truth about the missing children ultimately made it possible to bring their captor to justice and to rescue the survivors who had waited so long for freedom. The story of the 10 children from Oakwood Elementary serves as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind facades of respectability and religious authority, and that protecting the innocent requires constant vigilance from everyone in the community. While the price paid by these children and their families was tragically high, their story has helped prevent similar crimes and has brought awareness to the ongoing fight against those who would exploit and harm the most vulnerable members of our society. The aftermath of the case also highlighted the long-term psychological effects of surviving such extreme trauma, as both Rebecca Torres and Michael Chen faced significant challenges in adapting to life outside the cult environment, where they had been held for most of their adult lives. Both survivors required specialized treatment programs that addressed not only the immediate effects of their captivity, but also the deep psychological conditioning that had been imposed on them over decades of isolation and manipulation. Mental health professionals who worked with the survivors noted that their cases represented some of the most complex trauma they had ever encountered, combining elements of Stockholm Syndrome, religious indoctrination, and childhood developmental rest that created unique challenges in the healing process. The survivors had been systematically taught to distrust outsiders and to view the cult community as their only source of safety and belonging, beliefs that required careful and patient intervention to overcome. The legal ramifications of the case extended far beyond the prosecution of David Crowley and his immediate accomplices. The investigation revealed a network of enablers and supporters who had provided financial backing, safe houses, and logistical support for the cult's operations over many years. Many of these individuals claimed they had been unaware of the criminal nature of Crowley's activities, but their willingness to support his organization without asking difficult questions had made them complicit in the suffering of dozens of children. The case also sparked national conversations about the regulation of religious organizations and the need for better oversight of groups that operate in isolated communities with minimal outside contact. Critics argued that existing laws provided too much protection for organizations claiming religious exemptions, while supporters of religious freedom worried that increased regulation could infringe on legitimate faith communities. Educational institutions across the country reviewed their field trip policies and safety protocols in response to the Oakwood Elementary case, implementing new requirements for verification of off-site locations, background checks for any adults who would have contact with student groups during off-campus activities, and emergency communication procedures that would allow immediate contact with law enforcement if plans changed unexpectedly. The families of the children who did not survive their captivity established a foundation dedicated to supporting the search for missing children and providing resources for families dealing with similar tragedies. The foundation also funds research into cult psychology and child exploitation, working to develop better methods for identifying and rescuing victims before they suffer the fate of the Oakwood Elementary children.